What do you guys think? Is it working? Oh, we're on camera.
What's working?
Hey, how you doing? Let's talk about angles of training, and why, for example, if I'm doing a curl, we'll use the bicep because it's such a very simple muscle, right? It does one action, which is flex the elbow, and it supinates the hand. Why do we need to do different exercises? Why change the angles when, if I'm doing a curl, I'm flexing the elbow regardless of where I'm at, or if I'm, using my chest and horizontally adducting, my humerus, it's the same movement whether I do a bench press or a fly when it comes to relation to that muscle. Why do we do different exercises? Why do we do different angles? What's the benefit of that?
Yeah, so when you think about that, like a lot of times the argument is, well, I'm gonna get stimulate it in a different way, right?
Sure.
So it's gonna provide a different type of resistance. My body's gonna respond a little bit differently to a different angle. Just that slight adjustment will create an entirely new recruitment pattern, right? So, I mean, there's that argument for it. I think that if we get too fixated within one specific angle, you're going to get really good at that one specific angle. Then anything outside of that, we're going to start having problems.
That's a very good point.
Well, I know what we used to say. We used to tell people for muscle confusion.
Yeah.
That used to be the
yeah, that's
right?
true.
I mean, was that not the trainer pitch? Was that, if you want to build the most amount of muscle, you need to confuse the shit out of your muscle. That's what you wanted to do. That was like,
you believe that? I believe that.
Yeah, I think every trainer at one point in their career, you're lying if you say otherwise, thought that and used to teach that.
Such a horrible way to explain it.
It is horrible. Obviously everybody wouldn't be saying if it didn't have some sort of truth to it. I mean, there is something to be said about varying up your angles and changing the exercise. It's a new angle, even though it's not a new muscle you're working. It's in a different plane, therefore it's going to give you a different stimulus, which will create a new adaptation. So that versus the same thing over and over, there's some benefits to that. So, but I think it's kind of splitting hairs when you compare to the bigger rocks when it comes to training. The biggest thing that I see in it was, and this is something that I experienced myself. For this to really click for me was, I was the guy who used to vary every angle like crazy, do all that stuff. And then I got really into a lot of barbell lifting and just barbell lifting. And I built the most muscle I had ever built when I was focusing on the big four. Focusing on the big four, the overhead press, the squat, the deadlift, and the bench press. I built more muscle on my body than I ever had in the 15 years I've been lifting. But what I also noticed was the most amount of dysfunction in my body after that. And that was because I was always holding this fixed bar, and our bodies—
bilateral movements, and you're trying to, the signal itself is way louder, right? Because you're including your body at a greater capacity. So now I'm doing compound movements and things like that. So yeah, the benefit is you are gonna build a lot more muscle that way and having that type of training. But so that created problems for you.
Yeah, and that's why, was because that's all I was starting to do, was because it was giving me the biggest bang for my buck. I was so heavily focused on that. Then when I asked my shoulder to go in this weird angle or position, things would start to bother me. And then when I would start to try and address it, I'd realize that I've lost connectivity in these little tiny muscles that are responsible for the slightest bit of movement in my scapula or in my hips that were now creating dysfunction in other places. But yet I had these quads, or I had these delts and chests that I had built from doing all these great barbell lifts. So I think there's a lot of validity to playing with angles for purposes like that, because as humans, we don't move in these perfectly straight planes all the time.
But that begs the question, why? Why does it work that way? If a muscle's working, it's working. Why work it in different ranges? Why apply tension in different angles? What you have to understand, and this is a verifiable fact, is that muscles adapt in relatively specific ways. In other words, if I get strong within a particular range of motion, within a particular tension profile, most of the gains in strength that I'm going to get are going to be specific to the way I'm training them. It's just the way muscles work. Now, there's something called the sliding filament theory, which talks about how muscle fibers actually connect to each other, attach to each other, and contract. And if you think of muscle fibers, sliding along each other, at some point they hook onto each other and contract. And if I'm adding the most tension in an area with an exercise that may put my muscle in a stretch, my muscle fibers will attach here strongest and get strongest in this attachment. If I then change the angle so that most of the resistance happens in a contracted position, new attachments happen, and I'm getting more connections within that particular range of motion and
this
tension.
is where people try and argue the peaks or the parts of the muscle,
Right.
saying that they're building, you're focusing on the peak or you're focused on this by changing these angles.
No, and you're not going to see that. But what you will see is differences in performance, and you will notice better adaptations. Now, here's where people screw up. People mess up when they constantly change things so much that they never give their muscles the ability or the time needed to adapt to that new range of motion, that new exercise. This is why phasing is so important, where if I do choose a new exercise, a new range of motion, a new technique, I train within that for at least a few weeks, get good at it before moving on to something else. If I constantly change all the time, I never give my body chance to adapt to those new ranges of motion, those new exercises, and I end up it's all central nervous system adaptation. It has really very little to do with my muscle, where I'm just learning new balances and new exercises. I'll tell you what, you try a new exercise, it takes you a little while before you get good enough at it to really yield its benefit. And that's why mixing things up too frequently is detrimental. But it's also why if you stick in something for too long, it can also be detrimental.
Yeah, you got to think of it as you're teaching your body these processes, and the only way to learn it is to literally teach it for a certain amount of time in order for you to then, okay, I've really absorbed this, and my brain can go back to that specific pattern and that signal and that recruitment pattern. So if I'm not spending the time establishing that, like I haven't really established that if I move on quickly to this other movement.
Absolutely.
And then I go back and forth, and so my brain is just in reaction mode.
Yeah,
so.
let me give you another example. If I'm doing a curl, let's say I'm doing a dumbbell curl standing, and it's 35 pounds, really, it's actually 35 pounds right about here, right when I'm directly opposing gravity. From here to here, it's actually not the full weight because I'm not moving it directly against gravity. Here it's 35 pounds. From here to here, it gets a little lighter. And of course, you can test this yourself. You can get a really heavy dumbbell and support it way up here much easier than you could right here where it's heaviest. So as I'm doing these straight curls here, the tension is heaviest here, which means the muscle fibers in that position are creating the strongest attachments. As soon as I move to an exercise where, let's say I'm bending over now and doing the curl, well now, the heaviest part of the tension is up here in this very shortened position. So now my muscle fibers have to create stronger attachments within that position. This is why when you change your exercises, all of a sudden you get sore again. You're creating damage in new areas. So very important. Angles are very important for muscle adaptation, but it's also very important that you get good at these new angles before you move on.
Well, I think
to new ones.
the important piece to this, and I've been on both extremes. Like I've been the extreme, every single workout guy with a million different angles each time, and then I've been the guy who's straight 4 movements and lifting and letting my body get adapted and seeing myself build a ton of muscle. And both of them have their detriments. Mm-hmm. So it's so important to intertwine those or phase those, like you're saying. And when we talk about phasing, you don't want to spend it more than about 4 to 6 weeks top in that phase, but you want to give it enough time so that your body can adapt, can grow, and you get the maximum amount of muscle, but then also check yourself if you've been in there for months, which in my opinion, I think is the most common. People tend to get in camps because they felt like, hey, when I was doing all this stuff, I saw the best results, and then which is what happened to me. I varied things up a lot. I saw good results. Oh, then I switched over and I didn't vary. I focused on these major movements, saw a ton of results again. But then when I had to step back and go like, wow, both these times, what I did was I got stuck. There's an important piece to both.
Part. Yeah, because you feed into your strengths all the time. You want to go right into what's comfortable, and to be able to interrupt that process is really where you get the best results. So.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Mind Pump Wisdom coming right at you.